Tsar Nicholas II ruled over the Russian Empire from 1894. He inherited an empire with significant structural problems regarding land and the peasantry, ethnic friction, a rapidly growing urban proletariat, and a similarly growing educated middle class with liberal leanings. Eventually, Tsar Nicholas would be disposed of during the 1917 February Revolution, only to be executed by the Bolsheviks who grabbed power and unleashed a civil war in October. These revolutions ended the Russian Empire, but one significant revolution preceded them. The 1905 Russian Revolution was referred to by Vladimir Lenin as the Great Dress Rehearsal, paving the way for the eventual installation of a communist state over a decade later. The 1905 revolution, in contrast to the later ones, began in a non-violent manner. In February that year, a peaceful procession of over 100,000 unarmed civilians made their way towards his winter palace, but true in the Russian spirit, that day would enter history books as Bloody Sunday. Imperial soldiers managed to, turn it bloody with the indiscriminate slaughter of protesting civilians. Massive strikes and protests obviously ensued. The aftermath of what happened that day was an extraordinarily complex event that radically changed Russia's political culture and society. On January 22, 1905, the first clash between parties occurred in St. Petersburg. The two parties facing each other on the cold, wet winter's day were working-class citizens and soldiers loyal to the Tsar. 5 columns of working-class citizens slowly made their way to the city center, where the Palace Square and Winter Palace of Tsar Nicholas II were located. It was a peaceful demonstration, and nothing gave any indication that this day would enter history as Bloody Sunday. The group of protesters was unarmed, showcasing icons and images of Tsar Nicholas II chanting the Russian anthem, God Save the Tsar. The crowd was led by a youthful priest of the Orthodox Church, Georgy Gapon. He wasn't a revolutionary, but an organizer of the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers, which had its goal to hear and contain the growing dissatisfaction of the proletariat, instead of antagonizing it. This assembly was even patronized by the police and secret service, the Okhrana, of which Gapon not entirely coincidentally was an informant of. Now, the core of the strike consisted of workers of the large railway and artillery factories of Putilov, and this strike was characteristic of the sentiment throughout Russia. Low wages, long working days, increasing tax pressure due to the Russo-Japanese War, and the lack of civil rights and means to voice political opinions all made for a near-revolutionary sentiment among the Russian people. Gapon was to hand over a petition signed by 135,000 people requesting the Tsar for an 8-hour working day, a minimum daily wage of 1 ruble, about 50 cents, and a democratically elected constituent assembly to introduce a representative government gradually. The strikers figured that if they were to turn up at the Tsar's palace and he would see they were peaceful instead of aggressive, he would show solidarity with the working class. Once the Tsar realized their situation wasn't their own fault, he would surely give in. Well, Tsar Nicholas II wasn't too enthusiastic about tearing down the wall between the monarchy and its citizens. On the night before the workers' procession, Nicholas and his family abandoned the Winter Palace and left for the Tsarskoye Selo Palace a few kilometers outside the city. He tasked his Minister of Interior Pyotr Sviatopolk-Mirsky and Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, his generals and police commissars, to maintain order in the city. Just as every imperial civil servant, they feared any form of public protest, no matter how peaceful the intentions were. As the procession grew more discontent and voiced their anger and frustration over the rising taxes, lack of food, and horrible working conditions, these men became more and more concerned over the crowd. The atmosphere in St. Petersburg was the same as in the rest of Russia: tense. Strikes erupted in towns and villages, and due to a strike at printing presses, there hadn't been a newspaper for 2 days. As I mentioned, the workers of the Putilov factories went on strike as well. Government officials figured that under these circumstances violence could quickly erupt. As over 100,000 people held the procession through St. Petersburg, the men in charge figured the only response to these events was with brutal force re-establishing the autocratic authority over the masses. Orders were given to the soldiers not to let the masses come too close to the Winter Palace, though long before the procession had reached the square, people were forced to a halt by heavily armed police detachments. It isn't exactly clear what happened. All that is known is that the soldiers suddenly started firing at the crowd without provocation. Within several minutes, between 100 and 1,000 people were dead, and the crowd fled in turmoil. The autocracy sure displayed her power, but this was merely the first collision between the Russian people and the Russian monarchy. What happened today had long-lasting effects on the Russian society. To the Russian revolutionaries, the events on Bloody Sunday were a reason to rejoice. The first signs of an imminent revolution were finally showing. Leon Trotsky concluded, "The revolution has begun," although the Bolsheviks would not seize power for another 12 years. Tsar Nicholas, writing in his diary about that day, had a different vision of events. The death saddened him, but the diary entry emphasized his mother visiting him and his family. Talk about priorities. Now, the result of Bloody Sunday was a cataclysmic eruption of social disorder, and all social strata, regions, and nationalities of the empire were involved one way or another. And as time went on, the government started losing its grip on the events more and more, and Russia plummeted into a state that could be described as anarchy. The most serious development was not just that industrial workers went on strike, but civil servants, students, peasants, and even servants joined the movement. By the end of January, over 400,000 people were on strike, which would increase up to 2.5 million later that year. Non-Russian territories were affected most, in Poland with the Lodz insurrection, Finland and the Baltics. Nationalist feelings increased among the non-Russian population and increased hostility against the government. In regions such as Bessarabia, the anti-Semitic and far-right elements were utilized to create the Union of the Russian People, a pro-monarchist political party. In other parts, such as Charkov and Yekaterinoslav, street fighting was no rare sight, and the Tsar and the Russian government, they grew increasingly isolated. To complicate things even further, the Russo-Japanese War was still waging on. Russia suffered significant losses during the Battle of Mukden, denting the prestige of the Tsar and the government even further. Around this time, the workers began organizing themselves. Peasants living nearly below the means of existence and, in practice, existing as if they were serfs, began plundering the properties of their landowners. The liberal middle classes generally supported all these upheavals, if only passively, and blamed the government for the bloodshed. As for the war with Japan, Tsar Nicholas sent the Baltic fleet on an epic voyage to Vladivostok to replace the lost Far Eastern Squadron. The Japanese Navy nearly completely destroyed the Baltic fleet at Tsushima in May 1905, and the Tsar and his government had no other option at this point but to sue for peace. These events took place against a background of rapidly growing civil unrest. During spring, over 1 million workers struck in St. Petersburg alone. The peasant and worker strikes went combined with organized terrorist attacks on government officials. On June 30, Nikolai Bubrikov, the Governor-General of Finland, was killed. Vyacheslav von Plehve, the Minister of Interior, was killed shortly after. A surprising assassination was the murder of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, the uncle of the Tsar, and not too much later Viktor Sakharov, terrorists killed the former Minister of War. Unrest spread all over Russia and reached its peak over summer as Central Russia, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic provinces, and the Caucasus saw strikes, rebellion, and mutinies. Perhaps the most well-known event was the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin of the Black Sea Fleet. During this mutiny, the entire crew of the battleship rose up against its officers, killing 7 out of 18 of them. Sergei Eisenstein has immortalized this event in his 1925 film The Battleship Potemkin. Anyway, this mutiny, together with several other insurgencies around this time, was a warning sign to Tsar Nicholas that even troops loyal to him could turn on him. Chaos, turmoil, and strikes caused industry and production to halt throughout Russia. Taxes and prices increased, causing inflation and economic unrest. As the year progressed, the resistance against the autocratic regime kept growing. Now teachers, technicians, doctors, lawyers, and people from all walks of life joined the unions of workers in solidarity. Eventually, 14 of these unions allied themselves in the Union of Unions under the liberal politician Pavel Milyukov. These liberal movements supported constitutional reform and a representative government. They voiced their ideas at numerous congresses and lectures at universities, which became the centers for revolutionary activities. There were other openly revolutionary parties following the Marxist and socialist thought with the support of the masses instead of the middle class. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, established in 1898, was split between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. These contained future leading figures of the Soviet Union, Lev Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin. At this stage, these leftist parties didn't have that much influence yet, though they certainly shouldn't be underestimated. Both Lenin and Trotsky were abroad in 1905, and only Trotsky returned upon hearing of the revolution. He played an important role later that year. There were other groups on the left. Members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party had their supporters base among the peasantry and not the proletariat. There wasn't much cohesion among the left wing, and definitely not among the opposition, making it difficult to organize an all-out revolt. The first response of Tsar Nicholas after Bloody Sunday was on March 3rd, after receiving advice from Sergei Witte. Witte advised the Tsar to publish a manifesto. Nicholas did so, confirming his faith in the autocratic regime and condemning all those who violated the fundamental laws of the Russian state. At the same time, he published a contradictory manifesto in which he promised to establish a consultative body based on some form of election. The election procedure for this body was anything but representative, as it became known in August, and its powers appeared to be limited. It thus had no effect, and in autumn the strike movement in the cities resumed with even greater force. The Tsar wasn't willing to give in, disregarding widespread peasant uprisings across the land. At the end of September, it wasn't just peasants anymore, but once again people from all walks of life joined the strike, among which bakers, railway employees, and the postal telegraph employees, bank clerks, and whatnot. In October, the strikes turned into a general strike directed against the Tsar and demanding a democratic republic. It was at this point, due to the absence of other organizations, the workers in St. Petersburg began organizing their own Soviet. Workers did what they could to organize themselves. They improvised meetings, protests, and strikes and got in touch with the workers. Organization took place, and the result was a new type of workers' association, the Soviet Council of Workers' Deputies. The Social Democrats remained dubious about these Soviets at first, but the Mensheviks realized their potential. According to Jeffrey Hoskin, the first one was set up in the textile town of Ivanovo-Voznesensk to coordinate the general strike. Still, the one established in St. Petersburg would experience one of the greatest moments of the Soviets in October 1905. As leaders of the strike slowly trod forward, the St. Petersburg Workers' Soviet held a meeting. It was a rough meeting with some resemblance of a primitive democracy. Subsequently, similar Soviets emerged throughout the country. Eventually, the St. Petersburg Soviet had around 560 delegates, each representing approximately 500 workers. Because these Soviets could convince the workers to get back to work, even the government recognized their authority. The Soviet organized a general strike that disrupted normal production and communications around large parts of the empire. The Russian economy once again came to a standstill. Even the imperial ballet refused to perform. The Soviet became the vanguard of the attack on the autocracy. The powers of revolution in Russia had, in a way, shaped their own institutions when other institutions did not represent their interests. And its chairman? It was Leon Trotsky. After the arrest of the former chairman, Georgy Nozara, Trotsky was elected under the name of Yanovsky. The general strike throughout the country paralyzed virtually every industry. It twisted the Tsar's arm, and he could do nothing but grant the strikers and revolutionaries what they wanted. Finally, on October 17, the Tsar conceded that Russia would receive a representative legislature named the Duma and some sort of constitution. So, in short, this October manifesto promised civil liberties and an elective legislative assembly. On October 18, huge crowds took to the streets their celebrations as Leon Trotsky spoke to them from a balcony of the university building. The strike ended. Later that year, the Bolsheviks tried to use the momentum they thought they had. Now was the time to ignite a proper revolution and overthrow the Tsar. The result was an insurrection in the factory districts of Moscow. This happened in December, and it failed and was suppressed mercilessly by the army and police. That same month, Trotsky was arrested and sent into exile. It didn't matter for the revolution, though, as the Russians would finally receive their civil liberties and elected body. It cost the Russian population over 15,000 lives, and that was, in fact, the revolution of 1905. The revolution's climax was reached during the late summer when nearly every facet of life in Russia came to a standstill. The government was without power, and the Russian people were openly rebelling against the monarchy. So, what about this elected body, the Duma? And what about the civil liberties the Russians would receive? And what about the Tsar? Did he finally liberalize his policy? Well, In short, yes and no. The Tsar's October Manifesto was a precursor of the first Russian constitution issued in 1906. This rendered the empire a constitutional monarchy. The Duma, the body that resembled a parliament, was instated as well, but Tsar Nicholas, together with minister Sergei Bitter, rewrote the constitution. You're probably not surprised by this anymore, but they significantly curbed the Duma's influence. There's an older video on my channel detailing the workings of the Duma and the effects it had on the Russian monarchy. I'll link it on screen shortly if you're interested in that. Thank you for watching this video. If there's a topic or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will already gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.